EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is Brewing with Underwhelming Commanders, episode 42. If you're new to this series, I am just brewing with some underwhelming or more so unpopular commanders in the format, trying to give them a little bit of love. I do have a poll in the description below so that you guys can go vote on which commander you want to see in the next video. And the poll from last time turned out like this. And of course, the winner being Tymaret the Murder King. So black and a red, zombie warrior, 2/2. Pay 1 in red, sacrifice another creature. Tymaret the Murder King deals 2 damage to target player, or you can pay 1 in a black, sacrifice a creature, return Tymaret from your graveyard to your hand. So a couple of things going on here. First of all, we have a cheat commander tax ability, which is always good, right? If someone kills your commander, you can sacrifice a creature, return it to your hand, and cast it again. I would say probably I'm going to cast my commander for the 2 mana. Then if it dies, I will likely let it go back to the command zone because 4 mana is what I will probably end up paying anyway by putting it back in my hand. So I will probably let it go to the command zone the first time, cast it again for 4 mana, and then after that, anytime it dies, I can then start using that second ability of returning it to my hand to avoid that added commander tax. The first ability is really the one we're going to be building around here, though. Obviously, we're in a sacrifice theme, which Rakdos Colors does really well. The thing that puts people off of this commander is that you're dealing 2 damage to target player, which isn't super great in the commander format, and it would be really nice to have the versatility of the damage here where we can deal 2 damage to any target. If this was sacrifice another creature to deal 2 damage to any target, I think this commander would be a lot more popular. However, dealing 2 damage to a player is sort of a win con in this deck, right? That is one of the ways that we're going to win with this deck. We're going to be going after our opponent's life total directly, whether it be with our commander's ability or whether it be with an effect like Forge Boss. This is a perfect fit in this deck with this specific commander. Whenever you sacrifice 1 or more other creatures, Forge Boss deals 2 damage to each opponent. So this is really going to be going after our opponent's life totals. This ability triggers only once each turn, but our commander's ability allows us to sacrifice a creature on everyone's turn, right? So every single player's turn, we could be sacrificing a creature, using our commander's ability, and then also triggering our Forge Boss as well. Of course, there's lots of support in this theme. Judith the Scourge Diva, Mayhem Devil, both of them are going to be wanting us to either sacrifice our creatures or have our creatures die. And again, going to be throwing a lot of that damage around. Here we can be using this on our opponent's creatures as well, because this damage hits any target. Garna, Bloodfist of Keld, and Jury Master of Review, again, both great commanders as it happens, that also want us to be sacrificing stuff a lot. Jury, every time we sacrifice one of those creatures, we're going to be putting a counter on it. And of course, when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target, and we can sacrifice it at any time to do so if we need to. Garn is an interesting one because whenever another creature you control dies, draw a card if it was attacking. Otherwise, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So we can use our commander sacrifice ability or any other sacrifice ability we have in the deck during each of these scenarios, depending on which one we want, right? If we want to draw cards, we will just attack with one of our creatures, don't care if it gets blocked, whatever, we'll sacrifice it while it's attacking if we want the card draw. Otherwise, we can just sacrifice it to deal 1 damage to each opponent. Again, it's going to help us close out the game. That's how we're going to win with this deck. 2 damage is not a whole lot though, so we want to increase the damage that our commander is doing to our opponents. That's the big thing here, I think. Nikote is a great one because when equipped creature deals damage to a player, that player loses 1 life. So this is essentially going to be increasing the damage that our commander does by 1, because every time we hit one of our opponents with that 2 damage, they're going to lose 1 life as well. Torwaki the Younger will work in a very similar way, right? If another source you control would deal non-combat damage, that's what we're doing here with our commanders, non-combat damage, to a permanent or player, it deals that much damage plus 1 to that permanent or player instead. So this guy's going to work great with a lot of the other creatures in our deck that are throwing damage around. Remember, we got a lot of creatures like Judith and Mayhem Devil and Jury that are throwing damage around. Torwaki works with all of them, but also works with our commander. So every time we smack our opponents for 2 damage with our commander, it's going to deal that much damage plus 1 instead. So now our commander is going to be dealing 3 damage every time we use its ability. The best ways though here are Gratuitous Violence and Torbrand Thran of Redfell. Both of these are going to be doubling the damage we're going to be doing to those opponents. So Gratuitous Violence just says if a creature you control would deal damage to a creature or player, it deals double that damage to that creature or player instead. And again, remember, we got all these other creatures that are throwing damage around, so this all synergizes with the rest of our deck. But with our commander, now we're going to be hitting our opponents for 4 damage every time we use that ability. That's pretty darn good. And Torbrand again is going to be doubling the damage, but doing it in a little bit of a different way. If a red source you control would deal damage, which of course our commander is, to an opponent or a permanent opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. So again, essentially doubling the damage we're dealing with. Either of these things in play, our commander is now going to be dealing 4 damage to our opponents whenever we use that ability. That's pretty significant. Again, we're going to be doing non-combat damage with our commander, so cards like Chandra's Incinerator and Chandra's Spitfire are going to be great. Chandra's Incinerator says this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total amount of non-combat damage dealt to your opponents this turn. Normally it's going to cost 5 and a red, but if we use our commander's ability, we're going to deal 2 damage. It's costing 2 for our commander's ability, so we're not really down any mana there, but any other of our effects that can be throwing damage around will reduce the cost as well. We're going to get a 6/6 Trampler, which is pretty good, but most importantly, whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandra's Incinerator deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker that player controls. So now we can be dealing damage to our opponent's creatures, right? We deal 2 damage to our opponent's face with our commander's ability, and we can do 2 damage to a creature they control as well. So great added value there. And Chandra's Spitfire, 2 and a red elemental 1/3 with flying. Whenever an opponent is dealt non-combat damage, Chandra's Spitfire gets +3/+0 until end of turn. So again, just with our commander's ability here, we pay 2, sacrifice a creature, deal 2 damage to an opponent. Our Chandra's Spitfire now becomes a 4/3 flyer. That's pretty good. But if we can do it again, we're going to deal another instance of non-combat damage to an opponent, and our Chandra's Spitfire now becomes a 7/3 flyer. That is pretty terrific. So if we just look at this situation alone, we've now dealt 4 damage without any help from anything else we have. We've dealt 4 damage with our commander to an opponent, and then we're going to have a 7/3 flyer that can get in for 7 damage as well. That's 11 damage just with these 2 guys alone. It's going to be pretty easy to close out the game in that manner. Obviously, we're going to need sack fodder. Of course, there's lots of creatures in this deck that we want to be sacrificing, but we want to be getting added value, right? So we have Annex, Hardened in the Forge, and Pawn of Ulamog here that want us to be sacrificing our creatures, right? Annex says whenever an Annex or another non-token creature you control dies, create a 1/1 red Satyr creature token with. This creature can't block. If the creature had power 4 or greater, create 2 of those tokens instead. So this is just giving us more sack fodder, which we want, right? Every time we sacrifice one of our actual creatures, we'll get tokens that we can use to sacrifice. We do have 36 creatures in this deck, so there's going to be lots of creatures that we can be sacrificing and then getting the token creatures as well to be sacrificing. Of course, Pawn of Ulamog will give us that 0/1 Eldrazi spawn creature token. So again, doing a very similar thing. I thought Blade Wing Deathless Tyrant was a great fit in this deck. 5 red and a black, Dragon Skeleton 6/6, flying and haste. Whenever Blade Wing Deathless Tyrant deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, for each creature card in your graveyard, create a 2/2 black zombie knight creature token with menace. So we are going to have a lot of creatures in our graveyard, right? We got 36 creatures in this deck. We're going to be sacrificing them a lot. There's going to be a decent amount of creatures in our graveyard. So we cast this guy obviously later in the game. It's got flying and haste. We can attack with it immediately. It's almost assured we will be getting in for damage, and then we'll be creating a bunch of those zombie knight tokens that we can be using as sack fodder, which of course we want in the deck. I also got Ghoulish Procession, which whenever one or more non-token creatures you control die, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. This ability triggers only once each turn, but again, that's not as much of a drawback for this deck as it is with a lot of other decks, right? With a lot of Aristocrats deck where you want to be sacrificing creatures all the time, sometimes you want to sacrifice like 3 or 4 or 5 creatures on your turn. Here we don't need to be doing that, right? Our commander does have a little bit of a mana intensive ability, so we don't want to be doing it a whole bunch on our turn. More likely we will sacrifice a creature on our turn, then get this Decayed zombie token, and then on our opponent's turn, maybe we can do it again, get another zombie Decayed token. And again, of course, whenever one or more non-token creatures dies is our opponent's creatures as well. So this card is just going to be spitting out zombie tokens for us to be using as sack fodder for a commander all the time. Of course, I have Morbid Opportunist in here as well. Very similar aspect, of course, except with card draw instead of giving us those zombie tokens. Just a fantastic, one of the best card draw options in the format. Of course, if you are in any sort of a sacrifice theme or killing your opponent's creatures, whatever the case may be, just a really great card draw option for us in this deck. Couple other things I'm doing in this deck. I have Lizolda the Blood Witch in this deck, and funny enough, I just made a Lizolda deck a couple of weeks ago, which is in a very similar theme to this. Wasn't super difficult for me to put this deck together because I used a lot of the same cards, obviously, because you're doing a lot of the same things, and Lizolda, of course, can be a little bit of a backup for our commander. Pay 2, sacrifice a creature. Lizolda the Blood Witch deals 2 damage to any target if the sacrifice creature was red, draw a card if the sacrifice creature was black. So it's doing that damage effect, it's doing the sacrifice. We get the card draw as well. This can even be better than our commander in some ways. There's actually quite a few effects in this deck that can be backups for our commander, so we don't necessarily need our commander in play for this deck to be working, not by a long shot. I also threw Heartstone in this deck, which lowers the cost for activated abilities of creatures, right, by 1, so it will be lowering the activation of our commander's ability, which again can be pretty mana intensive. And again, Lizolda and a couple of other creatures in this deck it will be working with as well. It also works with our opponent's creatures, but I think that's okay. And I tried to find a interesting thing to do with this commander. It's a little bit of the typical Rakdos sacrifice theme, and I thought, man, I really want to do at least one thing in this deck that is sort of out of the ordinary and not something you would normally see. And I was looking at these abilities and I thought, what's kind of interesting here is that Tymaret the Murder King deals 2 damage to target player, which means we can do this on ourselves, right? We can target ourselves with this ability. But why would you want to be doing that? Well, I threw Blight Bad Influence in the deck. Just a fun little include here. 2 and a red, Devil Advisor 2/2 with flying. Whenever a source you control deals damage to you, put that many +1/+1 counters on Anti-Blight Bad Influence. So we can shoot ourselves with our commander's ability or any other ability we have, right? Again, we have a lot of creatures that are throwing damage around, and whenever we do so, we're going to put counters on our Anti-Blight, right? So we use our commander's ability, we shoot ourselves for 2 damage, put 2 counters on our Anti-Blight, so it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I know that doesn't seem super fantastic. However, I also have Whip of Erebos in this deck. Great recursion option in a deck where you're going to be sacrificing your creatures all the time, but also creatures you control have lifelink. So every time our commander is using that damage ability, we will be getting life. So we can get into a situation where we have our Anti-Blight in play. We can be shooting ourselves for damage, which we will then, of course, just gain the life back. So we're not down anything, and we can just pile counters on our Anti-Blight, and it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. And we can just have a really big flyer. Also, you can pay 1 and a red and tap and remove X +1/+1 counters from Anti-Blight. It deals X damage to any target. So another great throw damage around sort of ability. I thought that was a funny include in the deck. I want to do something, at least one thing that was a little bit different and sort of far out there. And I think it fits the theme of what we are doing. Again, at the end of the day, I guess you do sort of have a typical Rakdos sacrifice theme here. There is a ton of great support, as I've recently talked about, in this theme. This is one of those commanders that maybe you could revisit. It's been around for a long, long time, and since we have so much great support in the format recently for the sacrifice theme in Rakdos colors, this might be a good time to revisit a commander like this. And if you are thinking of doing so, of course, I have the deck list in the description below. Feel free to check it out if you're interested in this commander. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.